Welcome to episode 61 of the While She Naps podcast. I'm Abby Glassenberg. Today, we're talking about quilts as fine art with my guest, Luke Haynes.
Hey, good morning.
Hi, Luke. How are you?
Doing well, thank you.
Good. A chance encounter with a box of fabric remnants sparked Luke Haynes' imagination. His first quilt, measuring 7 feet by 10 feet, led him through years of experimentation and improvements. And he further honed his style and developed a system to piece manageable parts into a larger whole, applying a modern design sense to a familiar process. Luke Haynes, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. So let's start by talking about some recent fun news. You have a fabric line out.
Pretty exciting.
Yeah, it's your first line, and it's called Dapper. So tell us a little bit about it.
Well, so I'm working with Moda, the fabric company, and I've known the company and the owner for a number of years, and so they asked me to come on board and make a project. And it took a little bit of time to get behind the design of it. It was a big learning curve, but I think we've gotten somewhere, and I'm really excited. The line itself is half wovens and half prints, and the wovens are very traditional. So we've got houndstooth, herringbone, stripes, some plaids in there, but their colors are a little bit more poppy. So we get a nice kind of contemporary aesthetic while we have a more traditional weave. So you get kind of, hopefully the idea is a really good crossover between people's sort of experience with textiles, but wanting to kind of keep it really on the forefront of what's going on within the culture of quilting and making.
And did you have to learn like some software to be able to design this, or did you design it on, with pencil and paper, and they sort of helped you to make it into the repeat images? Like how did the actual, nuts and bolts of it come together?
Sure. I mean, they're a wonderful company. So basically, there's about 45 designers that work with the company, and not one of them does it the same way. I know certainly some of them send in oil paintings and say, turn this into a fabric line. And then others of us who are a little bit more computer savvy or computer, dependent, depending on who you ask, create images that way. So vector files or things like that, then they can kind of turn it into the repeats. Basically, as far as you can go within your skill set, you get it to them, and then they'll finish the rest for you and stick it on some fabric.
Nice. And you had just a ongoing friendship or relationship with them just from going to shows and that sort of thing. I'm just wondering how the collaboration, between you and Moda sort of first, came to be.
Sure. I was on the board for the Quilt Alliance for about 6 years with the owner of Moda Fabric, Mark Dunn. So he and I have been friends for that duration of that time. And so we were in communication about possibly doing, just in any number of things. And then I just mentioned maybe doing a fabric line. And he said, well, let's give it a try. Come on board.
That's great. Okay. So that's an interesting thing to think about. You were in a volunteer position, right, on the Quilt Alliance board, and made some good connections there, and were able to sort of help yourself launch this new, venture. So, that's really great. Congratulations on the line.
Thanks very much.
It looks,
I appreciate that.
It looks terrific. So, I wanted to go back a little bit to your start in quilting. I think for a long time you were using sort of found fabrics, like upcycled fabrics, clothing, that kind of thing. Your first quilt, as we mentioned in the introduction, was something that you made from a box of fabrics that your mom had found and given to you. So was there a point where you sort of shifted and started using some new quilting cottons, or a combination between new quilting cottons that you would buy in a store and the found fabrics?
Well, the bigger answer is I make my exhibitions or the works I like to keep the material in conversation with the story of the exhibition. So depending on what objects I'm creating and why, the materials will change. It's not necessarily, my body of work shifts between used or new. It really is trying to speak to the particular object itself that I'm making. For example, I made an entire series where I reappropriated postures from famous American paintings. So I took photographs of friends of mine standing like paintings that people know very well, would American Gothic. So I had friends of mine stand in that posture, and then I produced a quilt of them. And the background was a traditional quilt pattern, all made out of used clothing. And then the foreground, the figures, was all brand new fabric. And for me, it was a conversation between traditional quilting method, existing fabric, sort of a foundation of craft, and then on top of which adding this kind of brand new element of art, of raw edge applique. So there's kind of a more contemporary aesthetic going on there. And so it was a conversation in the fabric that reinforced what the ideas were within the exhibition I was creating. So really it depends on what the project is as to what material I'll use.
Right. Okay. I see. Yeah. And that adds a lot of richness because of the story of the fabric itself, and that coordinates with the story of that you're telling in the quilt. And you do a lot of that where you put a portrait of a person or of more than one person on a quilted back or a pieced backing that has a more traditional, maybe log cabin kind of pattern on it. And is that all raw edge applique? Is that how you do that?
Primarily. I mean, there's some other little bits and pieces in there, but mostly the figures on top are going to be appliqued over, like you say, a more traditionally pieced background.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. And you said that when you first began making quilts, you sort of made things up, sort of made up the process because, it wasn't as though you had been quilting at your mother's knee when you were a baby or something like that. So you kind of made up quilting or what you thought quilting was, and then later you learned that you were at best 20% right. So what kind of things did you kind of have wrong at first about what quilting was?
Oh my goodness. I mean, so there's a lot of interesting supposed tos within quilting, and I don't fully believe in supposed tos. I believe in, really researching what the history of a medium is, doing that on purpose, and then if you want to shift it, do that actively, right? So I don't think there are supposed tos. There's just traditions. And so it's important to know traditions so that you can shift it, within painting. Obviously, it's important to know how to create very good figures, but then you can change those perspectives or do something more abstract. And then within quilting, it's kind of matching corners and doing the binding by hand and, certain scales and certain materials and things like that, where I've definitely been, I've been informed what I've been doing wrong by members of the community, which I find to be rewarding. I like the conversation. I mean, I like that people are so engaged by their medium that they go out of their way to kind of bring me along, I mean, even if it's sort of with this quilt police hat on, quote unquote, people telling me kind of where my binding needs to be improved, it means that they do. And so, as I've been growing, learning a little bit about kind of, oh gosh, that method is so much faster and more efficient. And it comes from people being, helpful and saying, hey, here's how we do it. And here's why we do it, and then I'll give it a try. And most of the time it helps me learn something. And every once in a while I'll say, well, that's not quite for me.
Right. And I think sometimes that fear of doing it wrong and of the quilt police stops us from even trying, stops us from even feeling like it's okay to start somewhere, because you just know no matter what you do, it's going to be wrong according to someone.
Sure.
And I think in some ways, sort of starting blindly, like the way that you did, where you just like,
right,
I'm not really sure how this works. I'm just going to like sew some stuff together and make a thing I have in my head, without really needing to consult a book or talk to anybody. And then working your way backward to say, well, how do I make it flat? Like how do I get this to go together the right, a way that's easier and quicker and that sort of thing. And then you seek out the skills that you might need.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. 'Cause it can be scary.
Sure.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your upbringing. You were born in Durango, Colorado, but you spent a lot of time living in the South. And did you live in Mississippi? I also lived in Mississippi, so I was curious.
Yeah, I absolutely did. I lived in Oxford, Mississippi. My mother was in university there.
Oh, nice. I've been to Oxford. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's a great town. Yeah, and so you lived in a lot of places, though. You did a lot of different traveling, a lot of different states, and I wondered what your parents did that brought you to all of those places.
My parents had me pretty young, and they're both very adventurous and sort of education driven. And so what that means is once they split up when I was very young, I would go back and forth between them, and they have gone to I don't know how many universities between them, and gone and sort of pursued various careers and these kind of things. So I would go back and forth, and they would sort of follow their passions and experience to other places. And then I started going to really wonderful boarding schools, and then off, further into other things, so different boarding schools. So I would go from state to state depending on where kind of these education outlets would take me. So between going back and forth between my parents, who were pursuing a lot of really interesting educational outlets, and myself, I ended up having a foothold in quite a lot of places. I've lived in 14 states to date.
Wow, that's a lot. And were you by yourself, or did you have siblings who were kind of doing this with you?
Ostensibly, I was by myself. I've got a sister who is 11 years younger than me, but by the time she joined the ranks, this is a half sister. By the time she joined the ranks, I've been kind of going to boarding school, so we never lived together. So okay. I was kind of an only child for all intensive purposes and entitlement reasons.
And I just wonder, do you feel like in some way that kind of itinerant childhood where you're moving from place to place, does that, linger now in your sort of, I don't know, wanderlust or? Oh,
absolutely. I mean, honestly, the opposite in some senses, where I feel so driven to just plant some roots, to dig my heels in and say, I'm not going, you can't make me, because I've got so many wonderful people that I know around the world. It's just so amazing, and I feel so blessed every time I travel to see people. And then I come home, and it's like, where's everyone? I'm used to kind of being so global that when I come home, it's just a different feeling. And so my new goal is to try to do the opposite, and that would be kind of stay put a little bit and make a local community and these kind of things.
Okay, and you're in LA now.
Yeah, I'm in Los Angeles.
Okay, and is your studio space in your home at this time?
It's in half. It's broken in half, so it is in the same spot. Yeah, so one half of it is studio and one half of it is living.
Nice. Okay, and you feel like maybe LA could be a place to stay for a while at least?
Gosh, I think so. Until everybody who can't afford New York City or San Francisco move here.
Is the art scene in LA fun? I mean, is it a good place?
It really is. It's a really interesting one as far as commerce goes, and as far as one of the reasons for that is, unlike most other major cities, the people here, have space to put up art. There's really no more wall space left in New York City. And also people here spend their own money in an interesting way. So you see a lot of avant-garde artists. You see a lot of new artists really explode in a very quick time period because people, the patrons, the buyers will come and actually communicate directly with the artists, whereas the gallery scene is more prevalent in a lot of other art buying environments. Because LA is such a new art city, you find that there's a different paradigm here. So what that means is that, somebody wanting to buy a piece of art will research the artist versus contacting a firm who then works with a gallery who then pre-selects the artist. And so you see a little bit more of a quick artist to purchase communication, which makes art, which allows for new artists and for sort of people pushing a little bit of current boundaries to get their work up and out a little bit faster and try new things. So I think that's a really interesting community to be a part of.
Yeah, when you sell directly to the buyer, then you're not giving the cut to the gallery as well, which is nice, and you're developing that one-on-one relationship, and you don't have to have your art sort of pre-screened and accepted by the gallery system. You can kind of just do it on your own. So that's exciting, and it's exciting to know that there are people there who have money, who are willing to spend money to put art up in their homes and institutions as well. So good to know.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you went to North Carolina School of the Arts in Winston-Salem, and what was that like? Was that for high school or for college?
It was for high school. So it's a really wonderful school that's a part of, somehow inexplicably, the North Carolina public school system. And I say inexplicably because it's one of the best conservatories. It's the best conservatory for ballet in the country. It's one of the better conservatories for drama in the country. It's an amazing program in visual arts. It's got a college associated. So it's a high school that's got a couple years, and then it's got a college. So it's got a film program. The filmmakers coming out of that program do all the film cities in the world and do amazing things. I mean, it's a really impressive institution, but it's just part of the North Carolina public school system, and which is really wonderful. So I was able to go there. The visual arts program for the one that I was in is a 2-year program, so it's either the last 2 years of high school or the first year of college.
Okay, so you went there for the last years of high school.
Well, I was actually only there one of the 2 years. I went for the senior year of high school and then got accepted into Cooper Union, which is a school in New York City, and it's a really, really prestigious school. So if they say jump, you say how high. So I got in, so I went ahead and moved to New York City for college.
Okay, cool. And did you study architecture in college, or did you study art?
Yeah, I studied architecture. So I was in the architecture department at Cooper Union So which I feel like is not overly different. It's just the difference between kind of art and architecture is materiality and sort of spatial reasoning, I think.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of spatial reasoning between quilting and architecture for sure, and a lot of mathematical reasoning too. Okay, cool. And so did you finish your degree there and then decide to sort of try getting a job, or?
No, so I did 3 years in New York City, and then I moved back to North Carolina, worked for an architect for 3 years, because you can start accruing your intern hours after 3 years of an accredited college towards your licensure for architecture. And then you can go back to college. So I did 3 years of studies, 3 years of intern, and then went back for 1 year of architecture at another school in Georgia, and then decided, you know what, I'm going to go do this other thing full time. So I kind of just took an about face and went and created a career in quilting.
Yeah, that's amazing. So you must have really known when you made that first quilt, like there is a lot here and I've got a lot of ideas to express, a lot of confidence that this is going to be something. Or, it just seems like a big leap of faith to be like, it worked, right? Here you are. But it must have been a scary moment.
Well, it wasn't from my first quilt, because I was creating quilts all the while I was in architecture school, all the while I was working for an architect. It certainly wasn't. I didn't start my first quilt the day that I quit my job. Okay. That would be very precocious and impressive if I was able to do the first one and create a career out of it. I still feel sort of retrospectively precocious for saying I could make a career out of this, when at that point I knew so little about what the history of quilting and the traditions and methods and materials and all of this. When I started to make a career out of it, I had never been to a quilt show. I had never read a book on quilting. I just kind of knew the basic definition of quilting is 3 layers with batting, that's it. Mm-hmm. So having started a career in that, then I started to pay attention to what that meant.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about quilts as art, because I think that you, more than maybe anyone in the modern quilting scene right now, it's really clear that you really feel like quilts are a viable form of fine art. Yeah. So they're functional, but they can just be as visually striking as a painting, and they can certainly be museum quality. So you've said that you consider yourself to be a sculptor rather than a painter. And is that due to the functional nature of quilts? So explain that a little bit more.
Sure. The reason that I create that language distinction is that I'm actively creating objects, right? I'm actively creating something with a spatial dimension to it. And I feel like the thing that so often comes up in very early conversations with people who don't know about quilting or don't kind of have an experience with quilts as an artistic aesthetic say, oh, you're making something that's like a painting. I get it now. And I want to say, yes, that's a really good entry point, but no, you're wrong. In the sense that, yes, there's painterly qualities to some of the colors and tonalities, but I'm actively making an object, and I'm not alluding to something, whereas painting is an allusion to something, either, space or visual or color or something like that. The quilt is actually still maintaining an objectness. And I think that's a really important distinction, because I'm not trying to use a different medium to create a painting. I'm not using a different paint, as it were. I'm actually creating a functional object. And the root of a quilt is in keeping your knees warm, making your home pretty, putting these sort of domestic qualities into a functional object. And I think that's a really important thing that to not lose sight of.
So you sign your work on the front in the way that a painter does. And is that
Sure.
part of that same idea?
Well, I mean, not necessarily part of the same idea, but I mean, it's just, you sign your work. It's just part of, I mean, it does take I mean, if you look at the history of quilting, the signing often is kind of subtle or on the back, or, it's kind of just a marker of the maker that someone who, if anyone's interested into the future, might be able to find, and I definitely am a big proponent of standing by your work. So I try to put my signature on the front and, visible in some way. To kind of say, hey, I've made this thing and I've made it actively and I've made it for you to look at. It's not, you know what I mean? I think if you start to hide your signature and, put it on the back and this kind of a thing, you're sort of saying that what's important is the work and less so the maker. And I think it's important to honor the maker. I think that honestly, the difference for me, if you were to ask for a simple definition between craft and art, is purely intention. Right? If you want to make an art object, you've just made an art object. If you want to make a functional item, you've just made a craft object. And I think that there's definitely big gray areas where you can craft an art object. But if you need to make that simple idea, the simple difference is intention. And so if you want to say, I'm making an art object, I say, sign it on the front.
Uh-huh. That is fascinating. Do you know of anyone else who signs their quilts on the fronts right now? I haven't been to QuiltCon. I'm just wondering, like when you were walking around, or people that you admire or know of. I mean, is this sort of starting something, or do you think you're the only one?
I know there are some people who sign their work within the quilting. So they'll actually quilt, the stitching that goes through the 3 layers. There'll be kind of their signature implicit in those line work. And so I've seen that before.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I think you participate kind of in both worlds, and I like your definition of art versus craft being about intention, but you really do participate in the fine art world, and you participate in sort of the quilt and craft of quilting world. And so you've got this fabric line with Moda that we talked about, and you teach and you show at QuiltCon. And I think you've said like the art world and the quilt world see things differently. And I wondered if you wanted to flesh out, like, what are the differences that you notice in the way that those two worlds function?
Well, the biggest difference, and the one that I always like to illustrate when I'm explaining the difference, is quilters, crafters, makers of kind of objects that take a lot of finish work time, shall we say. I mean, this goes into kind of furniture makers, etc. But they start with their face pressed up against it as close as they can get, and they look at your corners, they look at your stitching, they look at your fabric choices, their tonalities. They get up close, they stick their face on it, and they say, okay, do I trust them at this level? And if they say yes, they'll move back a little bit and they'll continue that direction. Whereas from the art world, you start from across the room and you say, is it visually evocative enough that I'm going to go pay attention to how it's made? Is it cerebrally important enough that I'm willing to discuss the object that the artist has created? And so the difference between sort of the art world and the quilt world is where they start to digest an object or a painting or a whatever. The artists, museums, curators, collectors start from far away and then work their way towards the object as they decide they trust you. And quilters the opposite. They put their face on it and say, has he done his homework, and has he made the object with intention? Then I can step back and see if I appreciate the overall aesthetic of it.
I wonder whether the modern quilt scene is sort of helping to disrupt that a little bit. I mean, I feel like modern quilts, and your quilts for sure, are incredibly visually evocative from across the room often. So you walk into the room and I'm imagining like a really big gallery space, and you would see the quilt and be like, wow, from really far away. And then of course also want to get up close and say, okay, is it raw edge applique? Like, how did this work? So,
Sure.
Yeah, so sort of, it does work on both ways with a modern quilt maybe.
Absolutely. But I mean, I just in terms of if you want to make generalizations about the difference in the way in the difference in approach, I would say kind of craftspeople, people with this history of making fine objects really want to know that you've put in your time before they're going to trust what you've done. I mean, there's certainly a lot going on in the modern, quote unquote modern quilt world about big bold aesthetic and big bold simplified movements and kind of areas within the objects, and that is really interesting from far away. But you'll find that the winners of shows, you'll find that the people who get picked up to teach, you find that the people who get the highest reverence from these exhibitions are the people who have learned the trade. They're the people who, if you get up close, you can see mastery in the stitches. You can see the quilting on top has been done actively to enhance the object, that there's still a big focus on the making of as part is implicit in the object and why it's important. I mean, visually is really great, and that's coming out a lot more. But I mean, I think if you look, the subtext is still where a community of makers do it on purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an important distinction. And I think kind of another way the worlds might sort of clash when I think about it has to do with kind of help and helpers. Like I think about Andy Warhol and the factory, where he had people who helped him to produce the pieces that he's so well known for. And I know you have people who help you make the quilts that you show, because I often see the hashtag on Instagram, quilting for Luke. And I think that's probably common in the fine art world, for people to employ studio apprentices and studio helpers that kind of, help to make really big pieces, quick enough that they can actually be shown, and won't take the artist, their whole life to complete. But I think it's maybe less common in the craft world. So I just wanted to hear you talk a little bit about your arrangement with your helpers.
Oh, sure. I mean, this is a really, it's a can of worms conversation depending on who you talk with. There are certainly people who feel that it diminishes the quality of my work, that someone else has helped with parts of it, that I can kind of the piecework or the busy work, to people who I've worked with and have trained, or, trust their skill sets to follow the aesthetic that I'm asking of them, because the thing about hiring someone to help you is that the difference between hiring someone to help you versus doing collaboration is hiring someone to help you. You're asking them to do the work as you would do it, or as you've hired them to do, and so ostensibly they're giving you more hours in a day. They're just me and my team are able to make far more quilts in a year than I would be by myself.
Right, exactly. So how many people do you have kind of going at one time? They're kind of doing like I'm imagining kind of like the large backdrop that then the portrait is sort of put on top.
Yeah, exactly. So they help me with a lot of the piecework and this kind of a thing, which I think is, it's super, super helpful. The other part of it that I think that people don't sort of, I've had some negative comments about people helping me make my work, right? I mean, and I respect that from the standpoint of somebody who has painstakingly created an object, especially if you do it by hand, from start to finish. It's got a different gravitas in some ways. But I mean, my conversation is always, did you pick the cotton and spin the thread and hand dye it yourself? And if the answer to that is no, then you've had help. And
you definitely have.
And I feel like if people are diminutive of my work because I've had help with the piecing part of it, it's if I've trained someone to do it like I would do it, I feel like it just gives me more hours in the day to create interesting objects. And you can dislike what I make, that's fine. But I feel like unless you've hand spun every part of it and woven the fabric, at some point there's another hand at a different part of the process.
Right. Okay. And so do you credit them like on the finished piece at all? Or, I mean, how do you kind of compensate them for what they've done?
Well, I pay them for it for sure.
That's good.
It depends. I mean, I'm certainly happy to share the fact that I do work with people. I'm not kind of hiding them behind it. But on some level, when I'll write a book, they'll be in the thank you section and that. But I'm hiring them to do work that I've designed, created, picked the fabric, designed the method, and have got them to do the work that I've set aside for them to do specifically. So it's not so much asking for their input in terms of aesthetic and And I do a lot of collaborations as well, and those are obviously very well credited. But if I'm hiring someone to do my work, I'm very thankful, but I don't always put them, on every placard.
Right. Okay. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the process that you use, because I think it must be really interesting. I'm imagining that things sort of for the portrait quilts in particular, that they start with a photo, I'm guessing. And then in some way, the photo is kind of, broken apart into pieces, almost like a paint by number, right?
Sure.
And then, so just tell us, I'm not going to describe it because I don't actually know how it works. So tell us how do you go from sort of, if you're doing a commission, for example, of a portrait, how do you go from that photo that the client sends to you to a pattern that you can cut apart and make?
Sure. Well, so they'll send me the photo, and often what I'll do is create a mock-up on the computer so that me and the client can talk about color palettes and scale and, dimensionality and the kind of conversation between figure and ground, so that I can kind of have an idea of where it'll go. Obviously, it's a very different thing once it's rendered in fabric, and I add a lot of touches to it in the process of going from photograph to constructed object. But so I'll work in Photoshop to create kind of a basic mock-up for me to work from.
Okay. So you're taking that photo, you're using Photoshop as a tool, and then do you print it out like on a giant printer? Is that the next step?
I wish I had a giant. I mean, I use my printer, so it's just 8.5 by 11. So I'll make myself a template sometimes to really kind of make sure some of those areas are really definite.
Okay. And then you use that template to cut the fabric out.
Sure.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Neat.
Yeah, I've also used a laser cutter before. And then there's other times you just sort of freehand it. So there's a kind of combination of things, and everyone does it. I mean, when I try to show other people how to do it, I really shy away from just showing them my method, only because I want people to do it their own way. There's a lot to be said about hand drawing it. There's a lot to be said about, the skill sets it takes to create it in the computer. There's skill sets within, creating the files to use a laser cutter, and so I really, everyone does it a little bit differently, and, we all will end up doing some portion of all parts of it, I think, to create the best finished project.
Okay. And you travel and teach. Is that the skill that you teach, or do you teach a set of classes on a different kind of skill?
I don't ever teach that. No.
You never teach that. That is your sort of proprietary technique.
One, it's proprietary technique, but two, I don't want to just come in and say, let me show you how I preference is to come in and say, let me show you why I do it, because I would prefer people to come out of a class with me fired up to push themselves in whatever the things that they're already doing. I don't want someone to come in, take a class of mine and turn 180 and start doing figural work if they'd never done figures before. I want them to do, I want them to kind of follow the arc of what they're interested in. And sometimes that is figures and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's pushing fabric type and sometimes it's, experimental piecing or whatever. Plus in terms of creating images in this, there's a lot of color theory and stuff like that would go into teaching it in terms of a class. And very rarely do I have, weeks to months to work with a class to really kind of hone them in the skills that I would want for them to put into figural work. Plus, I really think that one of the things I get to bring to teaching is, hey, think about it a little differently. Like just that, give yourself permission to try something new and think about it a little differently. And that's really the things that I want people to take from my class. And so very often we'll do simple exercises that I'll guide the class on that are a little bit out of everyone's comfort zone, trying kind of, abstract piecing. We'll do some deconstructing of clothing, turning that into the material, changing the way that we use an archetypal quilt block, log cabin, for example, and then just shifting some of the elements of it to make a vastly different project. And so in doing that, people say, oh, I had never thought about that before, and what I'm hoping they take away from it is a consciousness within their studio practice, sort of not saying, I've designed the quilt, now I will just make this quilt. They will say, okay, I've designed a quilt, and now I've started to work on it, but I'm very actively working at each stage, and they can say, oh, I don't like this, or here's what I do like. I'm going to do that more or different into the future, as
Right.
opposed to just this rote quilts are this one thing. I just need to make them.
Yeah, and make
And it's not
150 of them that are all exactly the same.
right, exactly. And and that's a wonderful thing. And there's a lot, and if you make quilts for catharsis, if you make quilts for output for families and charities and love and, like nostalgia and use and all of this, like there's certainly nothing wrong with making the same block type 100 times. Really, absolutely not. I think it's a really wonderful pastime. It's a really just loving gift. But for people who want to take a class with the intention of pushing themselves and pushing their studio practice, they'll come to me, and my goal is to get them to see it actively, see it differently, see it with intention the whole time.
Yeah, so almost helping them to take on the role of designer,
100%.
and making those, because designing something and creating something is about problem solving, and
Yeah.
there's just tons and tons and tons of tiny and bigger problems throughout the entire process, and so taking on that role of problem solver for themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And you started, I think, with self-portraits a lot. And I wondered, how do you feel about self-portraits? Was that just out of necessity? Like, I don't have a model, or was there a reason, that self-portraits was sort of one of the first, things to focus on?
Yeah. I mean, you're 100% correct. Most people assume that it comes out of vanity or narcissism or something like that. But honestly, it was building a skill set that I was too shy to share publicly. So I didn't want to ask somebody to sit for a portrait, to take a picture of them to use for my quilts, or sit for me to take a sketch of to make a small quilt out of, because I didn't want to show anyone what I was making. It was just purely to build a skill set. And so I was the available model, and I went to art school, and you really hone your skills through recognizable imagery, right? So you do still lifes of fruits and vegetables that you can glance at a painting and you can say, okay, that flower has been rendered well, or, that green bell pepper is looking a little funny. They didn't get their perspective right. The same is very true of figures, right? I mean, that's why you do so many figure studies in art school, because if you've done it wrong right away. And so for me, taking portraiture and turning it into quilts is just a way of saying, okay, I know how to develop a skill set. You push yourself through recognizable imagery. I can use myself. And I just went from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yourself is right there,
Yeah, exactly.
It's easy. It's the easiest subject of all.
Yeah.
And perhaps maybe the hardest one too at the same time. But, and I noticed that you always or often spell your name in all caps. You've got a great name because it's a 4-letter name. So, and you can put it in all caps. And I wondered if you use your name sort of like a brand in that way, where it's all caps
100%.
like that.
It is branding. You in the world of fine art, it's about narrative. You create a narrative. Narratives sell objects. Narratives make interest. You write a book. It's a narrative. You create an exhibition. It's a narrative. You make a piece. You sell it to a collector. It's a narrative. It's a narrative. It's a narrative. And it's about being implicit in the process of creating objects. But also, it's about, from time, all the way back, right? The Renaissance, you see these big names in Raphael, Michelangelo. Like, why would those particular people have these major de Medici patrons? Why would they get the Sistine Chapel? And it's the narrative of name, and it's branding, and it's they're in that case, often it was a skill set they've developed. They want, the chapel to be painted by the best painter in the world, and that is about branding who's the best painter. And often it is a skill set that they've developed over time. And now our branding has to do with sort of bigger than life human narrative, right? Who do we hear about all day? Jeff Koons and Damien Hirst. Like, maybe we hate them, maybe we love them, but they're the biggest egos and personas in the art world, and so they make it in every museum. And Andy Warhol is another good example of that. Why is he important? Why is he interesting? Well, he created a name for himself that was recognizable in both the image as well as the lifestyle. And we see that in watch brands and in jean brands now. Everything is about sort of the human narrative. It's lifestyle. It's whatever. So I'm just a part of the world I live in, and I think it's really fun. I mean, for me, I really enjoy kind of go in all caps. It's my artist persona. It's the difference between sitting at home eating cereal and standing out on the street corner wearing one of my bright blazers and talking about quilts. It's the same me, just bigger.
It's the same me this bigger. That's good. And speaking of watches, I saw like a swatch, or was it swatch?
Fossil.
It was Fossil. Sorry. I saw an ad for a watch. It was Fossil watch, obviously. And,
Yeah.
with you, that featured you. So how did that happen? What was that like?
Oh, it was so wonderful. I got to do a commission for the corporation that was the centerpiece for their 30th anniversary. So they commissioned a large 10-foot by 12-foot quilt that I made.
And
And
what did it show? Like, what was the quilt of?
sure, so their branding is very much about sort of modern, mid-century modern. The modern vintage was the tagline, and so we have this really great old Chevy truck with this couple kind of leaning over it in front of this like really square, long-lined mid-century modern home with like a little toy rocket ship shooting off into the air. But it's all out of vintage used clothing, used textiles. So it's this really cool conversation between my work as well as their very particular branding and aesthetic.
That's so cool. Well, congratulations on that. That
Yeah,
sounds like
thanks very much.
a really neat opportunity.
Oh, it's so great.
Yeah. And are there other quilters that you admire and see that are sort of taking quilting to that fine art level in the way that you are? I mean, I know there's art quilting, and there's that's a whole segment of the quilting population are art quilters. I don't know if you identify as an art quilter or as a person who makes art through quilts, or sort of where that line is, and if there are people
And there, again, there's a big can of worms, and it's sort of tread lightly on there. But I think it's an important language. What an art quilter is somebody who says, "Listen, I want everyone to know that I'm actively making art." And again, this goes back to what I say the distinction between craft and art is. And so often people just project craft onto quilt as a method, and so people who want to make art signify that in their language. So I'm an art quilter. Pay attention to what I've done because I've done it actively, And I feel like that's really important as the culture shifts towards a viable medium to make art. And so I think that I don't call myself an art quilter. I'm using quilts as a medium. I'm an architect, really. I'm just using quilts as a medium to construct the exhibitions and conversations I'm interested in. So am I an art quilter? Absolutely. I make art out of quilts, but I'm a designer first. Quilts are the medium, and art quilters are people who say I'm elevating quilt to an art form. Come along with me on that. And so I think that the language is a really interesting distinction. I think they're very different, although they're not. Slightly implicit in the object is that difference, but I don't think that necessarily we two could make different objects. We could make the same thing, but the intention being slightly different, right? I mean, I am using quilts as a medium. I'm coming from architecture and design and kind of using quilting as a beautiful medium that has such a rich implicit history, and textiles have stories, especially used textiles or brand new textiles have stories in the weave and the colors. And so, using it as a medium really gives me a language to speak within an exhibition about any number of things. And art quilters are exactly like you said, saying, hey, we're actively taking what we're doing and we're making art out of it.
I want to talk a little bit about being a guy, because, there's quilting is predominantly female still. But you said that you feel like there's been a lot more male quilters coming on the scene, and that, there's YouTube now, and whoever's interested can learn these skills, and, people can take a class and get started with the materials no matter who they are. It doesn't have to be kind of a mother to daughter sort of tradition that's passed on anymore. So what's it been like to be a man in this industry?
Yeah, well, you get that question every time. That's for sure.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure.
It's what's it like? I won't say that it hasn't affected me at all. That would be, of course, untrue. I mean, I find that because of it, I am able to really sit on some good marketing. Honestly, you get a lot of shows out of it. You get a lot of press out of it. We as a culture really like outsiders and nuance and this kind of a thing, And so as a guy making quilts, people get to say, "Ooh, that's really different." I don't make quilts based on the sort of gender dialectic. I don't really make a great deal of my work sort of explicitly as a male. However, I am a male, so I didn't learn quilting through my family. There was a lot of quilting in my family, but I was to go play with GI Joes and firecrackers, which I certainly did. There's quilting in the female line of my family, and it wasn't until I kind of made it up and worked on it myself later that I got to come back and say, "Oh yeah, I remember. There was a bunch of quilts laying around that my great grandmother had made, and this kind of a thing." So I think that one of the things being a kind of guy quilter, you have to come out of the gate guns blazing because you've got a little bit more to prove. You can't just come in and say, "Hey, I'm interested in trying this." You kind of get askance glances. You have to come in and say, "Listen, I've already done this a lot. Help me do it better." You have to kind of push your way in some ways, because it's a medium based in community experience in a lot of ways. It's a lot about helping each other create these objects, and the history of quilting is really ripe with women empowerment and creating sort of these jobs when women couldn't have jobs legally, and creating these communities where people could kind of spend their afternoon together working on something for the family. And so there's a lot of woman implicit in the medium historically, and I think that's important and interesting. I personally don't make work about those aspects of it, however.
Right. And do people make assumptions about your sexuality as well?
Yes, rather regularly. And, which I think is an interesting, it's an interesting line to navigate, because on the one hand, who cares, right? I mean, why would it explain me making quilts one way or the other, depending on my sexual preference? It oughtn't, right? It shouldn't necessarily. I mean, there's obviously a lot of projection on kind of the gay community that they tend towards more, I don't know, feminine work or whatever. And maybe that's just because they have that permission to sort of go outside of normative gender guidelines. But I think that those assumptions speak to a lot of cultural implications bigger than just who I try to date, and I think that's interesting. I don't shy away from it, and I find gosh, I mean, how exciting is it that I live in a world where I have to come out as straight, where I kind of have to say, hey, I'm not what you think I am, and how does that make you feel, and do you still like me, these kind of things, and that's wonderful, right? How cool is it that I've had to? I mean, I had a major museum put one of my quilts up, and within the dialogue that they wrote in the placard next to the piece specifically said that I make work as a part of sort of being as a part of my history of being a part of queer culture, and that's 100% not true.
Mm-hmm. But they made that assumption.
And just made that assumption. And how cool is that I get to come back and to go the other way? How empowering is it from a perspective sort of global understanding that they're like, oh, it's cool that you're gay. Here's just why you make it, and I get to say, guys, actually,
right.
I'm not. And that's a wonderful place to be. That I kind of have to sort of fight for my place as a heterosexual, and I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. So I know you're working on a series of log cabin quilts. You're working toward making 50. How far along are you?
Oh, gosh, who even knows? It turns out 50 is a huge amount.
Really?
50 is a lot of quilts.
Yes.
Woof. I'm probably somewhere in the 20s range.
Wow. Yeah, and even there is a lot. So they're all log cabins. There are different iterations. And what is the goal of the project when it's completed?
The goal of the project is to, again, as we talked about, sort of me rebranding as a sculptor. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hang 50 quilts in the center of an exhibition space. None of them are going to be on the wall. Not a single one of them is going to be this sort of treat this like a painting, look at it as a visual object only. They're going to be hung in the center of the space. So you have to navigate around 50 distinct objects, front, back, sideways. And so it really creates an architectural environment that you have to sort of physically navigate 50 objects and around, and it creates a space, and it's about the materiality, and it's about iteration, and it becomes the scale of it is what's so important. Right, I could make a single quilt and I could hang it from the ceiling in the middle of a gallery, and you could say, okay, here's what I get from that. But if I do it 50 times, the viewer says, okay, well, he's done it on purpose. What can I take from that? What does it mean? What does the multiplicity mean toward the viewer? If you just hang a single quilt in the middle of a gallery, is it novelty? Is it accidental? Is it whatever? But if you do it 50 times, you have to kind of take the artist as intentional, and then you're able to view certain things about the exhibition that you wouldn't necessarily if it was just a single object. And so 50 becomes this kind of intentionality for me to prove to the viewers, like, hey, here's what I'm doing. These are sculptural, physical, spatial objects, and I want you as a viewer to understand that in the physical space.
That's going to be fantastic and really striking.
So wonderful. And I made so many of them because one of the intentions is to make more than the viewers can see. Like 50 is too many to stop and look at. I mean, there just isn't. If you went to a show of 50 paintings, you wouldn't stop and look at 50. I mean, you kind of navigate through and you find your favorites and you spend some time with it. And that's what I want to do. It's about, it is about that kind of overwhelming scale so that viewers and collectors or whatever really come in and see the intentionality behind it. And they're all iterations on the log cabin, all made out of reclaimed clothing, reclaimed textiles, red centers for the block, and then black and white fabric from there. So it's a very striking graphic. It's all very, from far away, they're just these very big graphic moments. Like, what does it mean to use a log cabin? What does it mean to change the scale of the blocks? What does it mean to switch the blocks? What does it mean to change the widths of each of the blocks? Like, these kind of small motions make a vast difference in the finished project. They're all 7.5 foot, 90 by 90 inches. And so you get these beautiful graphics from far away. And then up close, you get the textures of all the materials that have gone into making them. You get these pinstripe pants to, the Harry Potter sheets to, men's striped shirts to, just the whole gambit of material types, so that as a viewer, you come up and you get this kind of overwhelming entry point into what it's made out of. It's almost a conversation culturally with our discarded textiles.
Yeah. Have you been collecting clothing? I mean, you must have a lot to be able to.
Well, I will have used over a ton of clothing in this project. It'll go over 2,000 pounds easily to make these 50 quilts. And I go down and I buy it by weight. So I go buy hundreds of pounds of clothing at a time and deconstruct those into the materials I use for my projects.
I see. Wow. And where do you even buy 100 pounds? Where do you buy clothing by weight? Is that somewhere in LA?
Well, often big cities have a Goodwill outlet. And so that's the place that all of the clothing has gone through the Goodwill system. Nobody's wanted it this place. Nobody's wanted it that place. And it's the last vestige before it gets baled and sent to other countries or shredded or whatever they do with it, kind of after nobody wants it. And so you're able to drive a grocery cart through and fill it up as full as you want and buy it by the weight.
Wow. That's cool. Good to know. So is that your big project coming up? Is that the next big thing? That's
a huge thing. 50, I tell you what. So it's the launch of that is in February 18th here in Los Angeles. I'm timing it so that it's right the Thursday before QuiltCon, that same week, so that hopefully we can get a lot of quilters who are going to be in town who wouldn't otherwise to come to the show. So I will have some buses from QuiltCon to ship people down to it to see the exhibition.
Oh, how cool is that? That's terrific. I think that's going to go over really well. That's really neat. What a neat experience. So I want to just talk a little bit about some of the things that you wanted to recommend because you've got some good ideas on your list here. So one person you wanted to recommend their work is Alexander McQueen, and I know you're a big fan.
I am a fan. I'm a huge fan from kind of a bigger perspective, in the sense that I really like his work, absolutely. But in addition, and almost more so, I love what what it means to look at him as part of his industry. I learned so much from watching. There's a big exhibition of his work in New York, and then again at the V&A in London, and you can see what it means for him to be rooted in a community of fashion design, right? So his work comes from his personal skill set in making the objects, but then he has an entire team that he works with to create these lines. And only once a year, it's his job to create an amazing exhibition, and that really was very freeing and learning for me. My goal in life is to do one amazing thing a year.
Yeah, so almost using his career and how, as you said, his place in the industry and how he sees himself in the industry as a model for your own career. Obviously, you're doing something very different, but in some way, it helps to have somebody you kind of aspire to and look to as the way, how they've constructed their career. And because really, I mean, honestly, there's no mentor here. There's no, there's nobody who's tread this path before you. And so you have to find them yourself. And this is somebody who has done that. And so you can say, okay, well, what could I do in my own situation to be like that or to handle things that way?
Yeah, and what it's meant is I'm doing a fabric line, which means I'm honoring the community that I'm working with. It's not so much I'm over here making quilts. I get to say we are all making quilts. Alexander came out with jeans and T-shirts like the rest of them, but he made these beautiful exhibitions and that kind of spoke to what his work was that then would trickle down to people actually working with and purchasing. And I find that to be really dynamic. And so I get to make a line of fabric that I can work with and then other people can work with. So it's a conversation industry-wide that's not so small cyclically in my studio. I actually get to have a larger conversation now with a bigger community, and sort of looking at Alexander McQueen as inspiration for that was such a good benefit to my career and my understanding of what it is to exist within an industry and within a world of other people doing awesome things.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think all of us can find somebody. It won't necessarily be Alexander McQueen, but for each of us, no matter what kind of work we do, there's somebody that we could identify who's done it well. And we could, in some, pull from their career and help to use it to shape our own.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Okay, cool. I wanted to throw in one of my own recommendations if I could. So I just launched a new trade organization with my friend Kristen Link from So Mama So. It's called Craft Industry Alliance. And we have a team of people that we have to work with. We have a graphic designer and we have an illustrator and we have a copy editor talking about working with a team. Plus there's Kristen and I, and Kristen's on the West Coast and I'm on the East Coast. So anyway, we both also run other businesses, our own businesses. And so we have tons of email, and I'm sure you do too, have just tons of email. And so the fight to sort of keep our communication out of the email inbox led me to Slack, which is this amazing software that I'm going to recommend to people who are working with a team. So it's free. There's a paid version that gives you a couple extra features, but the free version is great. And it's basically like text messaging, but way better. And so there's a browser extension, and there's also an app for your phone. And you can just go on there. You make a team, adding all of your people, and you can chat all the time with everybody, and it's searchable. You can also upload documents. So if I say, okay, here's the printable we're going to be including in the next journal issue, and people can look at it, or you can upload photos, and they all live right there, sort of like Dropbox, but it's right there in your chat. And it's so great. So, you get a little notification if you have a message waiting, which is very helpful. And all that communication between our team, it can happen kind of like a live chat or not necessarily live, but when people find that they have a message, they can reply, and it just keeps it all out of the inbox. So if you do work remotely with somebody else, like you have a virtual assistant or you have a few other people who are working quilting for you or whatever, and you want to keep track of everybody, but don't necessarily want to be emailing all of them and losing all their emails and all of that, then Slack is a good solution. So.
Oh, great.
I wanted to recommend it because it's great. And you wanted to recommend one other thing, which are shoes, which I also would love to recommend because I love shoes. So tell us a little bit about shoes.
Just shoes in general, huh?
Just shoes in general, or the shoes that you love to wear. I saw a picture of you on Instagram the other day with some cool shoelaces, new shoelaces.
Yeah. Well, so recently I've had the pleasure of meeting a fine art cobbler.
Oh.
A man named Chris Francis here in Los Angeles. He did basically a residency at the Museum of the Craft and Folk Art Museum here in LA. And so he put his entire cobbler studio in their lobby and worked out of there every day they were open. And so I was able to hang out with him, and it really I learned a lot about shoes, and I started paying more attention to them. And I feel like all of a sudden, shoes have a lot of the same commonalities as quilting. If you take it, it's kind of rooted in function. But then, so rooted in function, but then from there you go towards, individuality as fast as you possibly can run. You choose your high heels, or you choose your sneakers, or you go Velcro, or you go, stretchy, or you go, open toes, or, this kind of a thing. And I just think it's so fascinating that these small objects are able to convey such a statement about the wearer, as it relates to both function and aesthetic and history and all of these really cool, interesting components that are just implicit in the objects themselves.
Yeah, and shoes are, there's a craft behind making them, and they're functional. So, in some ways I do see that similarity. Plus, your shoe size tends to stay the same, even if, so they always fit, which is kind of nice, like buying a handbag,
Yeah.
They always fit. It's always a good pick-me-up. So, yeah. Luke, it's been really great talking to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on the While She Naps podcast.
Certainly.
Yeah, and where can people connect with you best online if they want to kind of send you a message or find out more?
Sure. Well, the two ways that I'm the most present with would be Instagram, which is at Entropies, ENTROPIES, or just at my website, which is just lukehaynes.com, HAYNES. And then there's a contact page on there. If there's any questions, feel free to send me an email.
Okay, great. And you've been listening to the While She Naps podcast. Visit my blog, whileshenaps.com, where you can sign up for my weekly email newsletter. And if you enjoyed the show, tell a friend about it. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.